Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Happy early February and happy Black History Month. We're really excited to have this conversation today focusing on arts and culture, featuring Lawrence McCullough, who is the Publicity Director of Prime Stage Theater. Lawrence has been an active participant in our Calls for Community Solutions, I believe, since March of 2020, when we originally started hosting these. And while they early on were meant to be focused on post-COVID updates or, during COVID updates, making sure that nonprofit organizations and community members could see where resources were available, where emergency funding was coming online. They have kind of morphed into, over the last 2 years, an opportunity to provide resources and updates broadly for nonprofits. And I can see, as we are navigating all of the announcements and goings on at the federal level, and then state and local responses to what we're hearing in policy as it directly relates to the nonprofit sector, that these calls are going to probably morph back into some of that emergency response necessary and critical conversation convening around calls to action and things that we must do on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis to make sure that the work that we're doing maintains support and that the individuals that we're serving have access to the resources we provide. Since March of 2020, we've had 5,552 of these conversations with 47,464 participants. And so for today's conversation, we will anchor the conversation in the arts and culture presentation from Lawrence. And I'll be splitting my policy update with Jen Blatz from the Greater Pittsburgh Digital Inclusion Alliance, true to providing accessible and up-to-date resources. Jen's going to give a little preview of our presentation next week for the policy update portion from the Southwest Pennsylvania Partnership on Aging. For today, our frameworks are the UN SDGs and the social determinants of health, as usual, informed by the 8 R's of the Forbes Funds. This work ensures that we can align our work across the sector and beyond the sector with longer-term goals of our partner organizations and community indicators. So, for example, if an organization is doing excellent work with decent work and economic growth, or economic stability in terms of the very clear alignments with social determinant of health with economic stability and sustainable development goal 8, there are cross-cutting impacts and effects that are also going to affect industry and infrastructure, neighborhood and built environment, reduced inequalities, social and community context. And it really helps us paint as Fred says, kind of a tapestry of all the threads of connection, because no one organization has the answers that are going to solve all of the challenges that we're facing right now. And so making sure that we're using common language and building each other up in this work is more critical than ever before. So one of the questions that these calls are meant to challenge you with is, how is my work part of that broader tapestry, and how is what I am doing impacting others? And how's what they're doing impacting, the individuals I serve. As a reminder, this is a great time to put your name and organization in the chat, if you are able to, if you're in a place where you can type. Please turn on your cameras if you are able to. Again, if you're driving, we totally understand, but we do want to make sure that we're better connecting with folks during the call. This is a really critical space each week where we have the opportunity to see who is, working alongside us as part of the Forbes Funds ecosystem, but part of the critical Southwest PA infrastructure of the nonprofit sector as well. And I want to make sure that for GPNP members looking to connect and feel supported and feel seen and heard at this time, if you see somebody at an event, you can recognize them from a community call because your cameras were on, versus missing that opportunity. All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Our topic is on art and advocacy, and so this is a very thought-provoking presentation steeped in historical context and really excellent data around how theater has been used to problem solve and advocate for nonprofit organizations, and how it can be applied to the work that you're doing. So this presentation describes how your organization can use simple drama-based writing, role-playing scenarios, and help problem solve to advocate. This presentation looks at Prime Stage Theater's outreach program, specifically S.T.O.P, or Students Together Organizing Prevention, where Pittsburgh teens used playwriting and live theater to address urgent social issues they see in their communities, and issues that in some instances are literally life or death. Lawrence is a Pittsburgh author of 52 books of fiction, nonfiction, and plays, including 221 published stage works performed at schools, community centers, festivals, museums, historical societies, and theater venues in the U.S., Canada, Europe, Australia, Africa, Asia, Polynesia, and the Middle East. His commissions include plays on Galileo, journalist Ernie Pyle, 1920s jazz artist Charlie Davis, pharmacist Eli Lilly, Catholic activist Dorothy Day, Mercy Hospital founder Francis Ward, President Grover Cleveland, singer heiress Libby Holman, and for the National Constitution Center, a play on the U.S. Constitution. What better topic to kick off Black History Month and the conversations that we're having at the national level than how we can convene and advocate at a local level creatively and in community. So thank you so much for joining us, Lawrence. I'm going to turn it over to you to begin your presentation to maximize the time you have with us. But we really appreciate your time, attention, dedication to sharing your work with our sector. And we look forward to hearing your presentation today.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. Probably you didn't think you were going to be greeted with information that there is, in fact, a play about President Grover Cleveland. But is really what one of the main takeaways from this session will be: you can write a play about anything, particularly things, that are close to you in your community. So who has been to a live theater show lately? Hands up. And during the last year. Okay. Last 2 years? Okay. Last 5 years? Any ever? Some people never been. Okay. Was there any show that really moved you? Just think about that for a minute. You saw the play and learned something that you hadn't known, something maybe that really altered your perspective about something, some people, some bit of history, a political issue. I got to tell you, when I was young, I saw a little bit of theater, shows that my parents would take me to see, and I didn't think it was any big deal at all. We're talking My Fair Lady, Funny Girl. And I knew that actually they do deal with some social issues to a degree, but I didn't pick up on it. I was really into music, and that's where I was getting my knowledge about history and society. Then one day, I was 18, and I wandered into the student union of a college, and there was a play about to start, and I didn't know anything about it. And I think I stayed because I knew somebody in the audience and wanted to hang out afterwards. Then the play started. And it completely rocked my world, as the young people say. Title slide 1, please. It was a play called The Cage, and it was written by a man named Rick Clucci, who had a few years before spent several years as an inmate in San Quentin prison, life without parole. Well, Clucci started a theater group in prison, and they did Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, which had a great deal of meaning and relevance in that environment. And then Clucci, was paroled, and for the next 50 years, traveled the world writing and performing plays about his prison experience. Now, on this day, the actors in the play, The Cage, were all ex-prisoners. And watching this performance right there in front of me, it was the first time that I got live theater. This first time that I experienced live theater as anything than just basic entertainment, but experienced it as an art form that had something to teach me about the world and possibly myself. Now, I wouldn't start writing plays of my own until about another 20 years. But that event on that completely serendipitous day has never left my mind. And what I understood was that theater is a unique performance medium. It's different than film or music or dance. It relates to us in completely different ways. It takes your mind into a space that is immediate. It's telling you a story, and you are right there in that same physical space, literally, as that story is unfolding with these characters. In a way, it's kind of hyper real because it's in front of you or maybe all around you. And even though in one part of your mind says, this isn't real, you're in a theater, it's cold, it's hot, those are actors, maybe you know them. The props really aren't ancient Rome and Civil War, 42nd Street, the Titanic. But the theater, the medium, does something to our mental perception that other art forms really don't. It brings the audience, us, into the experience. not necessarily getting up on stage, but the experience of the world that play is portraying. It's really truly interactive because while we observe and analyze, our brains are processing the information, the dialogue, the setting, the scenery, the costumes, the sound, the lighting, excuse me, in a totally in the moment way. That doesn't happen when we watch a screen or even hear music or watch a dance. There's always a separation. But that barrier between us and what we see when people are doing some theatrical thing on a stage, that's dissolved. And we are in that mind space with the actors. Um, Title slide 2. There we go. Okay. In the late 1600s in England, there was a woman named Aphra Behn. She was a novelist and a playwright, probably the first woman to actually be a commercially successful writer. And she was also an international spy for the court of King Charles II. And one day, someone asked her, "Of what value, Miss Behn, are these little sketches that you write, these plays, as you call them?" Her response was, "Plays are secret instructions to the people. In things 'tis impossible to insinuate into them by any other means." So let's break that down. Secret instructions, information that you need to know, but maybe aren't necessarily going to hear about through normal media or social channels, issues that aren't going to be explored in depth, information, in fact, from which you might be intentionally and purposefully excluded. Secret instructions. So what you see on stage, again, the dialogue, the setting, the scenery, costume, sound, lighting, it's all coded in a special language, the language of the stage, of that world and that play. There's subtext information between the lines, things that can't be expressed in a conventional way to the people, which is you, me, us. And these things are important issues that affect us, the people, affecting us now in the past, likely in the future, things that need to be known, issues that need to be discussed or acted upon, but they maybe can't be raised openly for one reason or another. Or they have to be approached obliquely because for the playwright and the audience, your audience, the people who need to get this message, you have to get it insinuated into them by some subtle means. It's the only way you can really get that message across. Can't do it in a lecture, can't do it by showing a movie, can't do it even in one-on-one therapy. You have to find some other way to illustrate these issues, present them, discuss them, get the feedback, and that's what theater does, not just in the 1600s, but today. By the 1900s, people started using theater to talk openly about social issues. We've all heard the term melting pot. Now, that was actually the title of the play that was on Broadway in 1908. It was called The Melting Pot. And it was about immigration and religion and American politics and what kind of society do we want to build in this so-called new world. A fellow named Israel Zangwill wrote it. And it was really quite, it's still out there. You can find it. And from 1935 to 1939, slide 3, please, there was the Federal Theater Project. Has anybody ever heard of that? Part of the New Deal? Heard of the New Deal? Well, New Deal is a pretty big thing. Pretty much has given us the good things in the world that we enjoy today. Federal Theater Project was only 4 years, but it was founded and run by a woman named Hallie Flanagan, who was originally from South Dakota, ended up on the East Coast. And she refined a theater technique that was called the living newspaper, where a current news event is dramatized with live characters, sort of, performing this information, so that audiences across America, many of whom at the time were illiterate or in a complete news desert. I mean, this is Dust Bowl time, right? These plays were giving them informed information about important issues of the day. And often these were the very issues that they were dealing with. Better ways to farm, applying for citizenship, joining a labor union, registering to vote, organizing a political discussion or even a protest. 1960s, Chicago psychologist named Marshall Rosenberg started using theater techniques for what he called conflict resolution. Anybody heard of that? Ever been in a conflict resolution training group? Well, you may have actually taken part in some workshop like this. Typically, it's called nonviolent communication, sometimes compassionate communication, or collaborative communication. So over the years, theater became a tool to help people talk about things that maybe they didn't think they had the ability to talk about, or the permission to talk about, or place to talk about in public. Now, like I said, I didn't start writing theater till 1992. And a couple years later, I ended up as the administrative director of a theater company in Indianapolis. It was called the Act Out Ensemble. It was a social issue theater company. Title slide 4, please. And we created special theater programs for special problems. We would cover alcohol and drug abuse, anger management, bullying and teasing, date rape, domestic violence, depression and mental health, suicide, racial diversity, tolerance, AIDS, STDs, police training, literacy, workplace relations. Basically, people would call us that would identify a problem that they had in their school or their community or their business, and our actors would work with them to develop a dramatic program to address their issue. Now, the play script sometimes was very minimal because the idea was to create scenes that got the audience talking and participating in teaching themselves about the situation, in exploring what things they needed to be insinuating or have insinuated into them. For instance, in 1999, in the late spring, we got a call from a high school in Colorado, town about 15 miles south of Denver. You might have heard of it. It was called Columbine. And they had just experienced an event that traumatized not only local students, but the entire world. And they asked our Act Out Ensemble to come in and not just conduct a play about what had happened, but teach them how to use theater to begin to heal, which meant getting people in the community talking about something no one really wanted to talk about right then or had the vocabulary to talk about, but we did. So then, how can your nonprofit employ theater in a useful way? Well, here's an example. Prime Stage Theater has been presenting educational theater based on classic and contemporary literature since 1996. Their first play was A Woman Called Truth, and that's the story of Sojourner Truth. And they have a program led by the actress-director Linda Haston that uses theater to help teachers find new ways to teach literature in the classroom. Title slide 5, please. So for a number of years, they've had a program with high school students. It's called the S.T.O.P program, and that is Students Together Organizing Prevention. This past May, we presented Stories from the Heart, which was an evening of 4 one-act plays written and performed by 12 students from Phase 4 Learning Center, which is an alternative education center in East Liberty. This was funded by a generous grant from the L.C.H. Hillman Foundation and was suggested by Prime Stage Theater board member Richard Garland. Some of you may know. Richard Garland is at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health. He is a nationally accredited violence prevention counselor, uses a lot of conflict resolution techniques in his work, and he made the connection with Phase 4. And we had local actors, Wally Jamal and Kim L., guide the students. And essentially what they did was they showed students how to use the basic building blocks of drama-based writing and role-playing. I mean, it's not hard to find young people that want to express ideas and feelings, right? But teaching them the process and how to collaborate in making those private feelings resonate in a larger, more public, and more impactful way is what S.T.O.P does. So the sessions at Phase 4 worked through the playwriting process, just basically how you do it, starting with the students. And they decided what they wanted to write about. They wrote, they edited, they rehearsed, they presented the plays at KST Alloy Studios, and post-show discussion was led by Richard Garland. It was a very educational night for everyone. And I believe it provided these young people with a new way of thinking about how to express themselves, how to interface that expression with the adult world. And that if you could find the right medium, people will listen to you and what you have to say. So let's talk about some hypothetical examples of what a nonprofit might do, perhaps your group, and maybe you're already thinking about how we can use this. So the first step, who is your audience and what action do you want them to take? That determines what you want to tell. and the form that best allows you to tell it. So is the audience, I don't know, your board of directors, your staff, the clientele that you serve? Is this for training? Are you looking to find a unique way to engage the community at large or just particular stakeholders? As a community forum, this is a great way to get people talking about things, again, that they may have trouble talking about in a standard discussion format, or they're not going to write a memo, or they're not going to, you know, contact you in any formal way. But if you have a forum like this, you can get these ideas, you know, kind of up to the surface. Step two, decide what you want the audience to learn or discuss. Specific issue you want to spotlight. A lot of organizations do HR exercises with scenarios involving customers or internal relationships among employees. I think some DEI training has done this. And it's basically just basic role playing, the kind of conflict resolution format that Marshall Rosenberg used. And maybe there isn't a resolution to the conflict, but at least it gets the dialogue started. Maybe you're having a board or a staff retreat. You can use these techniques to highlight issues or challenges, ways to go forward. A lot of times, we tend to talk about an issue in a static way, a way that's passive or distanced. We describe it with words and PowerPoints and data, which is good, but sometimes you might find it more impactful if your concern literally is acted out, not just described, but put into the reality of a live situation. Because when you use a theater forum like this, you can stop the action and comment. You can have the audience replay a scene. They can express ideas that come to mind in the moment. They can even rewrite their own script and have the actors play it out. Again, because there's something about suddenly being in the moment, in a moment where you've never been, in a moment you can't control by flipping a button on or off, or, you know, changing your screen. It's a moment that brings a special kind of clarity, that may provide insight and possibly new ways to see and approach the problem. Now, a question you'll all have, I'm sure, is, can you do this yourself? I think for the first time, it is helpful if you have a facilitator who has had experience in creating drama-based scenes for a group, someone who can guide the process, keep things moving, keep things focused. And for that, you'll want to give the facilitator a really clear idea of what you do want to achieve from the session. Now, if it's just exploratory, fine. But if it's a specific issue, let them know. And if you've done it once or twice, I think you can create your own program. You don't have to be a professional actor or theater major or a playwright or have any training per se. But like the saying goes, sometimes you can see a little better up close if you stand back and look from the distance. And I know some of the Forbes Fund folks here are thinking, how do we get AI involved in this? Is Skilly ready for showtime? We'll circle back to that, as they say. But there's always a possibility to refine this process, and I see no reason why, you know, we can't use a tool that, you know, really kind of enhances the human dimension of what's happening. A couple other things. I was just kind of looking at some of the nonprofits in our area. Here's a local nonprofit called Apraxia Kids. I don't know, anybody heard of that? Apraxia, A-P-R-A-X-I-A. It's located on the north side. Apraxia is a motor speech disorder that makes it difficult for children to learn or carry out the complex sequenced movements necessary for intelligible speech. A person with apraxia has a good understanding of the language and they know what they want to say, it's not coming out. So you could create scenes where a young person is getting ready to go to a new school. They're anxious about meeting new friends. What are the emotions involved? What are the things they need to do maybe that could help them feel less anxious? And you could dramatize those concerns, present them to the staff at the school, even other students, so they have a better understanding of apraxia. Here's another one, the Charles Street Area Corporation up there, Perry South, I think. It's a resident-led group that advocates for the community. They have many improvement projects, and one is called a Greenway Cleanup. And maybe they could use additional volunteers. So could you create scenes that show the importance of a Greenway Cleanup? Something that could be perhaps presented at a gathering of potential volunteers. Again, you know, you have your PowerPoint, you'll have your speakers, You'll have your, requisite light refreshments. But if you present some scenes that personalize the benefits of the cleanup to the audience, a lot of times we call a volunteer meeting, somebody talks, but what if you're able to actually show that experience? Um, and I don't want to completely discount video. That also is a tool. Um, and for something like this, you could video some of these short scenes, create the scenes, put them on film, post them on your website, social media. It's a little bit more than a PSA, because not everyone might be able to attend your live event for the volunteer meeting, but you can still use some drama, a drama base to kind of frame the conversation. Um, I think there's also an organization here called Crisis Center North. Um, and its mission is to empower victims of domestic violence and cultivate attitudes and community behaviors that break the cycle of violence. So when you think of cultivating attitudes and behaviors, that is obviously a very important part of fighting domestic violence. Can we show these attitudes and behaviors in realistic episodes to kind of clarify what those attitudes and behaviors are? It might be useful for training their hotline operators for various situations. I think the center also offers legal and medical advocacy, school-based prevention, education, rapid rehousing programs. So having people trained in all these areas could definitely incorporate theater, kind of enhance that experience of what's going to happen when you get real people involved. Um, you know, any others come to mind? Anybody thinking of something you might do in your nonprofit environment? Well, if you do, just give me a call. Um, but like I say, I've been kind of just working with this and seeing this kind of work in really a lot of context for a number of years. And again, I don't want to imply that, when you present, you know, conflict resolution scenes or, dramatize some of these things, that you're going to have all the answers or that it's going to be immediately resolved. But I think it starts us off with a way of, some really good questions and ways to get people to listen, maybe kind of get through, some guard barriers that they might have to listening to this information, um, kind of just insinuate those instructions to the people. Um, any questions or thoughts or?
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I know that you kind of asked for some examples of storytelling. One of the things I really want to focus on for like the advocacy side of this, right, is a lot of what we're seeing at a national level. Addresses a lot of disbelief, I think, sometimes that people have when seeing something unfold in real time. I've heard a lot of individuals recently just kind of express shock at the impacts or potential impacts of some of these executive orders, especially for the ones that are currently being stopped or paused, through court action. And I think the biggest lesson in advocacy, to take away from that is that people really need a story illustrated and kind of told from the perspective of, how this is going to touch your life, versus being exposed to facts and figures, right? Because that hasn't been extremely effective in terms of expressing the impacts of some of these policies. And so in that broader context, have you seen anyone doing this at a national scale, really effectively, or at a local scale? Like you said, you've given us some really good examples, for how we can kind of either like replicate, or is there like a toolkit or, a resource that we can kind of think about, at the local level? It seems like there's a lot of storytelling that's needed for individual stories, for organizational stories, and, where's really the best place to start to make that impactful?
Well, I sure wish we still had Hallie Flanagan with us, from 100 years ago. And it's what we're really talking about there is kind of a living newspaper technique. When we get done here, folks should Google that and, just kind of check out some of the things she did. Yeah, I think what you're really talking about, Emily, is getting people informed. Again, headlines are a blur, you know, social media posts are, you know, kind of come and go. Um, but yeah, the arts really do portray in so many ways help us kind of grasp situations. Like I say, when I first saw The Cage, I wasn't in prison, wasn't thinking about going to prison, didn't actually at the time know anyone in prison. So in a way, it was completely divorced from my experience, but it was the immediacy of those actors acting out those scenes about this world that I just said, I want to know more about it. I just want to use that technique in other areas that do impact me. And I think that's the thing, that we can all relate to a little bit. Yeah, basically the Republican Party has been trying to really eliminate what we would call the social safety net. Well, really since the New Deal, actually, but certainly since Reagan's time. And it's been just 4 decades of just chipping away, and creating a society where it is kind of like 1929 again. Nobody looks out for you, and it's just tough, and that's kind of the way it is. Social Darwinism, whatever you want. Obviously, in the last century, we have come a long ways, where we've decided as voters that we think an important part of government purpose is to provide a social safety net, is to provide our tax dollars with helping people, in just all kinds of ways to live prosperous and secure, productive lives. But then there's people in society that don't believe that. Right now, they've got the political power. So, yeah, just use the arts in any way that you can, because sometimes it does reach people in a way. Um, you know, that maybe they're not going to be reached in any possible way. Yeah, I mean, I can just see a living newspaper thing. There was an article the other day, the Washington Post had article about a voter in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which for the first time went Republican in a long time, and it interviewed a woman who voted for Donald Trump and had this idea that the Republicans are all for the working people and they're just going to just make my life wonderful. This is a very economically disadvantaged woman who describes the circumstances of her life. You're not going to get to her, it didn't seem, by providing facts and figures and having her at a webinar and, I don't know, sending her PDFs or getting her to listen to Heather Cox Richardson. It just isn't going to reach her. But maybe if you can get her to some local arts thing that talks about these issues, and in her sense, she was realizing all her social safety net programs that she and her family depended on could disappear now that the Republican administration is in Washington. It just kind of dawned on her. So after her panic subsided, how do we get her to be informed? And I think maybe the arts can do this in various ways with people. You just secret instructions, got to insinuate them into the people. The people want to know these things. Even the most low information, the most gleefully low information voters we know, at heart, I think they resist information about politics, but there are ways to get it to them because they sort of want that information, but they're going to fight it if you do it in conventional ways. So that's my thought. It's a massive project, but this is what we do. We just never stop.
I love that you highlighted that, Lawrence, because I think, especially as someone who volunteers in the arts myself, I see when we're in the stage that we're in right now, art is just falling from the mind, falling from the headlines back to being on not just the second back burner, but the third one, because many people are going into crisis mode. And it's so important to help people understand how intertwined and how fundamental this is. I mean, art is what sets us apart from other species, right? This is fundamentally human. Everyone on this call, we are here to serve humans. How can we make that work for us? How do we, use that as a form of communication? So I really appreciate, especially the way that you've connected, how we can really bring it into this work, especially for those who aren't really ready to hear it.
Lawrence, I know, but as we were getting ready for the call, we talked about one of the specific policies that was going to affect a lot of organizations doing this work as part of their mission, not necessarily, organizations that do direct service or other work, who are looking to do more arts advocacy as a tactic of, bringing folks in, and better telling their story, but of organizations that are based in the arts and humanities portion of the nonprofit sector, or working with those organizations that are affected by the Trump administration disbanding the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities, the reversal of the former President Biden's executive order looking at the PCAH and the intent to continue conversations after it was initially disbanded in his first administration in 2017. And you had given some really critical historical context related to the Reagan administration, and I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of speaking to that a little bit and sharing a little bit about what the anticipated impacts of that are.
Well, as you pointed out, Emily, the nonprofit sector is huge. It's just thousands of jobs. And when County Executive Sarah Innamorato was trying to get her budget passed, again, as she pointed out, we're talking 3,000 of our neighbors are going to lose their jobs. There are people providing services every day that the private sector isn't going to provide. And that's where your county tax dollars are going. So again, the arts, and their studies, the Americans for the Arts, other groups, pretty much every year have a study showing the huge amount of not only people that have jobs in the arts, but people who are affected. I mean, you go to a Taylor Swift concert. Anybody go? You go to a Beyonce concert. You go to any concert. Think it's some huge event. There's people. Who are the people parking the cars? Who are the people, the coffee shops and the bars and the entertainment? It's like the ripple effects of any arts event, even if it's just going to your church choir, or a open mic at a coffee house. That's commerce. That's jobs. And the arts provide that because it does bring people together. What the National Endowment of the Arts and Humanities were created for in the 1960s as part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society is to spread that around through, the country, to get underserved areas, particularly rural areas, to know that you could, not only enjoy the arts, but you could produce them and you could use them in a community context. It's not just going into a symphony hall, hearing something, walk out, that you could really use community. You could use the arts to address community issues. And that's what the arts have been doing now, the NEA and NEH, for 40 years. And they're telling stories, they're getting people together. And right now there's a political party that just doesn't want to do that. They don't want to invest in that. They're not stopping. We're not quite, 1930s Germany, where people are saying, this cabaret is kaput. We're not having performances stopped per se, but the funding chain that we get from the NEA that goes to state, that goes to county, that goes to local, is just enormous. And so, and PBS as well. That's how so many people get information about what's really going on or what has gone on in our society, these great documentaries. And to defund all of that would just make it harder for people to, kind of find their place in society. And right now there's a political philosophy that says that's okay. We don't subscribe to that philosophy. We say it's not okay. And but that's kind of what's happening. And it will have incredible spin-off effects, not just to, like an arts company that, oh gosh, guess we have to get real jobs now. How many times have you heard that, Christine, and everybody here? Grow up and get a real job. Well, providing arts is a real job, and it provides so many other jobs. But that's really the impact. So when you see a headline that says, Republicans or executive order eliminating the NEA, and you think, well, it doesn't bother me or it doesn't affect me. It will at some point, along with every other program that, again, as citizens, we've said, we want our tax dollars to go there. I want an elderly person in Arizona to receive health care treatment. I don't know them. I'm never going to probably meet this person, but I want them to have that. And as voters, we've decided that over the decades. And now their voters are saying they don't care. So, that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Lawrence. And I'll provide a little bit more context to the decision to disband the PCAH. But before I do that, it is February 3rd, and on February 10th, our next call for community solutions, we have ceded the policy conversation to the Southwest Pennsylvania Partnership on Aging, because there's a lot of conversation happening right now about the impacts anticipated regarding the cuts to Medicaid. And to speak a little bit about that conversation, what we can anticipate next week, we invited Jen Blatz, who is the director of the Greater Pittsburgh Digital Inclusion Alliance, to join us this morning to give a little bit of preview, some initial data, and to share, what we shared last week with one of the board members of SWPPA, just kind of, planning for that conversation and making sure that it answers the primary questions of folks on this call. So thank you so much to Lawrence. Jen, the floor is yours, and then I'll jump in for the policy updates at the end of the call.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Emily. And thanks, Lawrence. That was really interesting. And I'm going to reach out to you about somebody I know who I think has a great idea that I'll seed with you and see what you think. Anyway, so I wear several hats, as many of us do when you get into your mid-50s. You're wearing lots of hats all the time. So today I'm wearing my Southwest Pennsylvania Partnership for Aging hat. In my day job, I run 2 digital equity and inclusion coalitions. One is the Greater Pittsburgh Digital Inclusion Alliance, and the other is the Keystone Internet Coalition. So as you can imagine, the Greater Pittsburgh Digital Inclusion Alliance is more for local folks. And then we have a statewide organization that is focused on trying to advocate across the Commonwealth for better access for folks to not only be able to afford the internet, but amazingly, a lot of people around the Commonwealth still don't even have decent access to high-speed broadband. So that's the genesis of what our work in the coalition is around. And this is certainly connected to my work on the board of the Southwest Pennsylvania Partnership for Aging. I think I see a couple of folks here who are members of SWPA. And SWPA is a 10-county, also a membership organization that advocates for older adults and people with disabilities. And we are primarily a provider kind of organization, but in light of the events of the last couple of weeks and months, we are putting together a much more kind of grassroots advocacy campaign. And that's what I'm teeing up for you today. So I just put a link in the chat, and I'll put a couple of more links in the chat. But specifically what we're trying to do is create some kind of, they won't be one-pagers, 2 or 3-page documents for each county in the southwestern Pennsylvania kind of footprint, specifically about what Medicaid cuts, which can be done in the reconciliation process very quickly, very very swiftly, will do potentially to affect services that will really impact all of us. So the idea is that with SWPA leading the charge, we'll kind of organize in each of the 10 counties attempts to reach out to our primarily federal electeds and state level electeds, just to sort of put everyone on notice. We are watching, we are very concerned, and I don't think anybody is pacified by this idea that that the worst kinds of things and the most draconian cuts won't happen. I think we've all seen in the last couple of weeks that anything is possible. So we feel like now is the time to start mobilizing folks. So my colleague, Joe Angelelli, who will be here next week to make the presentation, is much more versed in this. I'm here just sort of representing SWPA as he wasn't able to be here today. So I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. We'll see you next Monday. And hopefully we can encourage some of you and your organizations to join in this mobilization to protect Medicaid for sure, and also to figure out how, and I know GPNP's one of your main goals here is to kind of break down the barriers and silos between different areas of work within the nonprofit sector. And I think SWPA can play a big role in that. So I'm happy to take a couple questions if anybody has any.
I think one of the questions that we talked about was what are some of the kind of like resources or information, like data points, right, that each of our organizations can contribute? Are you all doing a survey? What are some of the early calls to action that we can be preparing for in advance of next week?
If I can Emily, if I could just share my screen, I want to show everybody kind of a snap of one of the sets of talking points. Is that okay? Okay.
Of course.
So this is kind of what we're hoping to create for each county. So specifically about what Medicaid cuts will do to our state budget. And then as we kind of move through this, now this is a lot of information. But we're really breaking it down so you can use this information and it will be sourced in whatever way you deem necessary for your particular organization. Some folks, this is a kind of tangential thing to what they're doing, but I think the main goal that we have at SWIPA is to raise awareness of how substantial these changes will be. And we're also trying to figure out how to best advocate with our friends in the health plans, which who are going to have, you know, pretty substantial voice in this, but also will be really important allies. So we're sort of figuring all of this out, but this is the kind of thing you can expect for each county in the sort of 10 county southwestern Pennsylvania footprint. Does that help, Emily? Good, great. And then I'll also share, let's see here. I also had a clip. So I shared the Kaiser Family Foundation clip. There's also a Politico clip, which is 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old. So now it feels like it's ancient history going all the way back to January 10th. But it also explains how these cuts can happen within reconciliation. I think it does a pretty decent job of explaining that, just to kind of give you a sense of how this is going to potentially work its way through the government. I don't want to take up any more time, and I'll just throw my this is my email and my cell in the chat. And so we'll see you next Monday, hopefully. And then just for everyone's information, SWIPA is going to we're having a meeting this Thursday at 4 o'clock to kind of organize ourselves. And that's our policy committee and our board to sort of start putting this together. So if your organization really wants to lean into this, we would be happy to invite you to participate in that conversation as a guest, even if you aren't a member of SWIPA.
Thank you so much, Jen. I appreciate your quick work, SWIPA's quick work, and just kind of pulling all the necessary folks together and doing so increasingly accessibly, putting your cell phone in the chat. But that is kind of what the momentum of the time calls for as we're coordinating all these pieces. If I receive any follow-up questions or have any additional thoughts, partners that I should loop in, I'll plan to CC you and Joe on the intro email, and then that way you know what's coming, who's going to be in the room next Monday.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate your having us. Thanks.
Of course. Thank you so much for coming. Regarding other policy updates, there are quite a few, but I'm sure everybody is seeing a lot of the headlines. And so before I get into the data points and what is happening and all those pieces, I do want to highlight two things. So during our public policy committee meeting at the end of January, the number one response to our check-in of how is everyone feeling today was worried, followed very quickly by concerned and exhausted, but also determined, supported, resilient, hopeful. And I mention this because there are a lot of feelings related to this work. And I think when it comes to advocacy, nonprofits are also often encouraged to be nonpartisan or bipartisan in messaging. And so we have to be really careful talking about, current administration, Republican Party, even if those are how headlines are painting the information, right? The data points that we have to be really careful about sharing and the talking points do need to remain nonpartisan and bipartisan and focus on here are the things that are going to likely happen. Here are the impacts to my organization. Here are the impacts to the people I serve. And as difficult as it is, keeping a lot of the emotion and partisan language that really fuel media headlines out of the conversations. And that's really tough. And so one of the things that I'll get into today is how we can kind of do that and hold each other accountable and make sure that we're setting ourselves up to continue doing this work in the next 6 months or 8 months and not kind of get checked by the IRS or somebody who's reporting us for lobbying, in the next couple of weeks or months. And so this really is a marathon, not a sprint. And I say that because if the last week felt overwhelming, it is because we got 100 days worth of news in 5 days. Given the amount of traction that a lot of these headlines are getting across media outlets, you're likely seeing the same headline and same information multiple places, multiple times. And so all of this to say, the best response in terms of a coordinated advocacy approach at this point is to dig into what you are great at, what policies are going to directly affect the work that you're doing, and lean in where you have assets and skills and resources to share with those conversations, and also block time and boundaries around seeing where other headlines are popping up, because no single organization or person within an organization, even if you're a policy director, with 10 years of experience in this space, is going to be able to track thing. As I'll demonstrate during our policy headline overview this morning. But I really just want to encourage you to take your rest and give yourself grace when you're having moments of feeling completely pulled in or even spiraling out of control as you're reading these headlines, because it is emotional. These decisions and their policies are going to impact you. They're going to impact the people that you serve. And that's a really scary, helpless feeling. And also, you have an entire network of experts in our region who are feeling the exact same thing and are ready to support, because it's much easier to call somebody into this conversation when you both have a really solid foundation of like, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm not doing, here's what I can contribute, here's where I need support, versus everyone, feeling like they're spiraling out of control and not knowing where to really grow those roots. And so the headlines are going to keep coming, and we're going to have to get really discerning around what we pay attention to, because it directly affects our work, and we're the expert, we have to pay attention to that thing, versus what we pay attention to because we're signing a petition or elevating the work of a partner, or making sure that we're making a connection to the right person at the right time. It's a lot of coordinating and a lot of collaboration, but this is the mission of GPNP. This is what we're here for. So if you have questions or needs for support, or even want to share something and you can't be a speaker on a Monday call, please send it to me and I'll share it during one of these updates. So creating a central hub for policy updates and action steps. This is in the works right now. Christine and I are meeting later today on our member portal to have Slack channel updates, making sure that events and resources are shared on the member portal. And the reason that we're taking this approach is because having it on the website is searchable. And so looking for mission driven description of organizations through GPNP membership could lead people who would use that organization against organizations serving immigrants and refugees or individuals with DEI policies. And so making sure that we're being really careful around what's being shared in an open source space versus a collaborative space is one of the early steps that we're taking. So creating a central hub for policy updates and action steps that also protects our member organizations and the individuals that are employed by them. 2, fostering collaborative networks of support. So exactly what we just talked about and what Jen is doing this morning as an example, strengthening alliances to share resources, using a space that already exists to talk about resources and talking points and supports that are available specifically on Medicaid, and how we can continue to be creative, to be mutually encouraging as we navigate these challenges together. And then empowering resilience through mission-focused work. This is digging into where you're an expert, discussing how your organization can adopt or pivot as a need to preserve its mission while also mitigating risk of being targeted and defunded. We have to get really smart again around what are the things that we need to do and have to do versus the things that we're feeling pulled to do. It feels nearly impossible to step away from certain things, but in order to continue this work, we do have to create a collaborative model that is based on trust, because there are organizations that are probably going to close in the next 4 years, and the people that they serve need to continue receiving services. And so we can either have a proactive collaborative conversation, or be scrambling, 6 to 8 months from now when those things start to happen very rapidly. And then fourth, encouraging compassionate advocacy. So prioritizing humanity. Christine, thank you so much for talking about the difference in experiencing the arts that humans have versus every other species, because we are humans that serve humans. And that's why this work is really important. So understanding all these efforts, even in a climate of fear and opposition, that is really central to the work that we're doing. And finally, number 5, which was added over the weekend, getting your house in order to ensure we can continue doing this work in perpetuity. There are 2 things that really need to be balanced within each organization right now. So one, organizational sustainability versus sustainability to members of the community and the services that are going to sustain them. So if your organization is a critical organization to this nonprofit sector in Southwest PA, and if you go away, hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose services. You need to make sure your house is in order. So filing your 990 with the state, ensuring your advocacy and lobbying are IRS and state regulation compliant, and filing your annual report with the state of Pennsylvania properly this year. If your organization is a supporting organization to some of those larger organizations, thinking through getting your house in order, and also how can I maintain services for those I serve? Is there a partnership? Is there a merger? Is there a strategic conversation my organization can be having with others that are doing this work versus competing against them to stay open? Now is the time to have that conversation. And if you need, resources or guidance around how to start navigating that, that's an area where Forbes Funds and other capacity builders in this space can be really helpful. There are a whole host of consultants and coaches that do nothing but that for their work and can set us up for success in this region to continue delivering services. Again, I already mentioned safety and support for nonprofit sector. Policies affecting arts and culture organizations are what we dove into a little bit this morning, but here's a quick snapshot of the different areas that are going to be discussed on these calls for community solutions. And then looking at a very brief review of the headlines and items that are likely to impact the nonprofit sector. We talked about the Trump administration disbanding the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. The Department of Education did announce Friday that it is going to officially enforce the 2020 Title IX regulations. And so this is looking at a lot of the headlines you probably saw over the weekend related to CDC articles and research being conducted around pregnant women versus pregnant people, biological male versus male. And this has, huge impacts for the trans and queer community, especially. But this also makes it really difficult for victims of sexual assault to report harassment, or victims of sexual harassment or assault to report that. And there are also issues in terms of due process requirements that these that the executive order is going to impact. And so, this is a really good example of the headlines around this decision are saying one thing, but there are also far-reaching consequences that are deeper related to this work in terms of the legal or due process pieces that are going to impact the entire population, not just a subset of the population. And then finally, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 is something that gives the president broad powers to regulate various financial transactions upon declaring a national emergency. And so this is what you're going to see referenced a lot in terms of sanctions being imposed, justifying export controls, restricting certain transactions and outbound investments. Legal experts are still questioning the president's ability to use this act to impose tariffs. And so, as is has been seen across a couple of different executive orders, there are differences in how something gets implemented versus how it is written in an executive order. And that's where use of law or court challenges might be where actions or advocacy are taken, where things are not necessarily going to happen as stated in an executive order, and it just takes time to determine the items that are going to stick versus the ones that have that can gain traction. And then finally, thousands of government web pages have been taken down since Friday. As nonprofit organizations, this is something that's extremely important because a lot of our information that we reference is often open source. And so with government websites being a pretty consistent resource for that, this is something that we should be taking a huge notice of and looking at, how other places are going to track and report this data while this is missing. And so this includes, I think the biggest headlines I saw were around CDC, vaccine, veteran care, scientific research, hate crimes. And there's a lot of other pieces of information that are being taken down. And so some agencies, it's just a single web page or a handful of pages. Others, it's entire sections of their websites that you can no longer navigate to. And again, while over 3,000 pages were taken down from the CDC, which are going to have broad-reaching impacts on health and public policy, here is a list of all of the other pages that have been taken down across government websites. And so again, really highlighting some of the differences between what you're seeing in the headlines, what's being most reported, and some of the things that are absolutely going to affect you. So while, early learning and, pre-K to 5 programs are, getting the CDC updates, there are also 200 pages missing from Head Start. For organizations doing urban planning and financial planning, there are IRS pages missing. And so making sure that we're able to refer to the most up-to-date policies around advocacy and lobbying and the space where nonprofits can be really effective in between. We're going to have to either refer to historic information or find this information cataloged elsewhere. And there are a lot of groups at the national level and local levels looking to figure out, what is missing and how we can find, how we can, access that. But just as a heads up that, reading between the lines on some of these headlines and doing research is necessary. And that's where leaning into experts within our network versus doing all those things by ourselves is extremely important so we don't burn out. Again, nonprofit organizations should educate on the issues, including, staff and those you serve, encourage civic engagement and discourse and conversation. This is where we can invite a lot of those folks into these conversations. Monitoring policy impacts, make sure that you're setting, blocking time and setting boundaries around what you're doing in the space versus saying, hey, I need a partner that's really tracking this thing. Can I call Jen or Joe or somebody to tell me more about Medicaid so I don't have to look into that? And then also maintain neutrality, staying nonpartisan as a rule of thumb, and bipartisan when engaging is the the only space that we can really navigate carefully as nonprofit organizations. And so we have resources sharing, the difference between advocacy, lobbying, electioneering, how to keep your organization in the clear. But I'll share more about that next Monday. And here's our snapshot of where different resources can currently be found and the things that are currently being built out to support your organization in these spaces over the course of the next 24 to 36 hours. And just a huge thank you to Lawrence and Jen for speaking this morning. Next week, we'll have Kate Freed from the Regional Capacity Building Initiative and Jen and Joe again to talk about the impacts of potential Medicaid cuts. Thank you so much for spending an extra couple of minutes with me this morning. I appreciate your time and attention and look forward to seeing you next week.